She was one of the most powerful rulers in human history. She commanded fleets. She outmaneuvered kings. She turned England into an empire in the making. And she did all of it, while being, by almost any modern standard, absolutely, thoroughly, magnificently disgusting. Welcome back. Today we are talking about Queen Elizabeth I of England, and specifically about 5 hygiene practices so revolting, so jaw-dropping, and so perfectly documented that they have survived for 150 years of historical record entirely intact. This is not speculation. This is not exaggeration. These are the things that the people who lived alongside her actually wrote down and then apparently decided the world needed to know about forever. Let us begin. Number 1. She bathed roughly 4 times a year. 4 times per year, in an era when even that was considered. And this is part that should truly alarm you, unusually frequent. Elizabeth's contemporaries noted with something size approaching admiration that she bathed once every 3 months, whether she needed it or not. That phrase, whether she needed it or not, was apparently used without irony because the baseline expectation was that a person might decide, after careful consideration, that they simply did not need a bath this quarter and move on with their life. To be fair, bathing in the 16th century was not what it is today. There was no running water, no hot tap, no private bathroom. A royal bath required servants to haul enormous quantities of water, heat it over a fire, carry it to a specially prepared room, fill a wooden tub, and then remove all of it afterward. It was expensive, laborious, and time-consuming, and so most people, even wealthy ones, simply did not bother. You changed your linen. You accepted the smell as a universal feature of human existence. Between her 4 annual baths, Elizabeth relied almost entirely on a practice standard for Tudor royalty, changing her linen shirt frequently. The theory in Tudor physicians genuinely believed this was that clean white linen absorbed sweat and impurities from the body, making it essentially equivalent to washing. It was not. What it actually did was give the skin a brief encounter with clean fabric before both began accumulating everything they were going to accumulate until the next change. The result over months was a smell that contemporaries described in terms that polite history tends to gloss over. Ambassadors who had audiences with the Queen noted the experience with a specificity that makes it clear they were not speaking metaphorically. Number 2. Her teeth were black. This is not a rumor. This is documented by multiple foreign visitors to the English court who described Elizabeth's teeth in detail. And the detail they most consistently reached for was the color black. By the later years of her reign, her teeth had decayed to a degree that was visible from across the room, and the smell of her breath was, according to at least one German visitor, difficult to tolerate at close range. The cause was sugar. Elizabeth was obsessed with sugar in a way that went beyond ordinary fondness. Sugar in the 16th century was an expensive luxury, a symbol of wealth, of refinement, of access to the exotic trade networks that were reshaping the world. Elizabeth consumed it constantly and in every form available: sweetened wine, candied fruits, sugar paste sculptures, honey cakes, and the emerging fashion for what the English called poomf, sugar-coated seeds and spices that people carried in their pockets and ate throughout the day like modern candy. The effect on her teeth was catastrophic and progressive. Tudor dentistry consisted primarily of extraction. If a tooth hurt badly enough, you had it pulled and that was the end it. There was no filling, no crown, no root canal, and there was certainly no coherent understanding that the sugar she was eating multiple times per day was the direct cause of the decay destroying her mouth. By the time she was in her 60s, she had lost so many teeth that speaking had become difficult. And court observers noted that she sometimes stuffed cloth into the gaps in her jaw to restore the shape of her face. For public appearances, a foreign ambassador actually wrote home to warn his government that when meeting the Queen, they should prepare themselves for the fact that her speech could be hard to follow. Not because her English, but because of what had happened to her teeth. Number 3. Her makeup was slowly poisoning her. Elizabeth's face is one of the most recognizable images in Western history. That chalk white skin, the high-arched brows, the vivid red lips, the mask-like perfection of the royal portraits. That look was not natural. It was not even cosmetic in any modern sense of the word. It was a daily application of a substance called Venetian cerise, and Venetian cerise was a mixture of white lead and vinegar. Let that settle. Every morning, Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting applied a paste of lead directly to her face and neck. The lead gave the skin a smooth white, even appearance that was considered the absolute pinnacle of fashionable beauty in 16th century Europe. Pale skin signaled that you did not work outdoors, that you were not a laborer, that you were above the sun and the field and the common world, and no substance achieved that paleness more effectively than lead. What its snorts also did over years of daily application was eat through the skin. Lead is corrosive. Prolonged exposure causes the skin to pit, to scar, to develop sewers and uneven texture, which created a darkly ironic feedback loop because the damaged skin required more ceruse to cover it, which caused more damage, which required more sushi. Elizabeth's skin in her later years was, according to those who saw her without the makeup, badly scarred and deeply discolored. The mask was not concealing natural aging. It was concealing the damage done by the mask itself, and the toxicity did not stop at the skin. Lead absorbed through the skin and through inhalation because sushi dried into a fine powder that Elizabeth breathed all day, accumulated in the body over decades. Lead poisoning causes mood, instability, cognitive deterioration, joint pain, fatigue, and a long cascade of neurological symptoms. Historians have debated for years how much of Elizabeth's notoriously volatile temperament and her increasingly erratic behavior in her later reign may have been neurological in origin, and the daily lead application is always part of that conversation. She was painting her face with poison every morning for decades, and so was almost every other fashionable woman at the European courts of her era. Number 4. The state of her wigs. Elizabeth began losing her hair in her 30s. Likely as a result of a serious bout of smallpox, she survived at age 29. The disease left her face scarred, another reason for the heavy makeup, and thinned her hair significantly. By her 40s, she was essentially bald on top, and by her later years, she wore wigs almost exclusively for any public appearance. She owned at the time of her death over 80 wigs. What she did not do at any point was wash them. Wig hygiene in the 16th century was essentially non-existent. Wigs were brushed, sometimes powdered, occasionally perfumed, and that was it. They were never laundered. They were never treated for the insects that inevitably colonized warm, unwashed human hair, and a wig worn against a human scalp for weeks, stored in a warm room, then worn again, is precisely the environment that lice and parasites find absolutely ideal. The royal court almost certainly had a lice problem. What made Elizabeth's situation distinctive was the sheer number of unwashed wigs cycling through her wardrobe, each one a potential reservoir placed back onto the royal head on a rotating basis. Court ladies who dressed the Queen's hair were by the standards of their job, regularly handling objects that would today require protective equipment. Number 5. The royal court smelled like a latrine. This one requires a brief explanation of Tudor palace architecture, specifically the complete absence of anything resembling a functional sewage system. The Palace of Whittle, Elizabeth's primary London residence, housed at any given time between 100 and 500 people, quarters, servants, guards, cooks, and the countless hangers-on who attached themselves to the royal court in hopes of advancement. Every single one of those people needed to relieve themselves multiple times per day. The palace had a limited number of prives, essentially holes in boards positioned over cesspits or directly over the tanks, and those prives served nowhere near the population using them. The result was that people relieved themselves wherever they could find a corner. In corridors, behind tapestries, in unused rooms, in fireplaces, behind doors. Contemporary accounts described the smell as overwhelming, and records showed that the royal household periodically had to vacate an entire palace, Windsor, Hampton Court, Whitehall, simply to allow it to be cleaned out. This process took weeks. Elizabeth complained about the smell of her own court repeatedly. She issued orders. She threatened punishments. None of it made a meaningful difference, because the problem was not discipline. It was infrastructure. There was no system to handle the biological reality of 1,500 people living in the same building, and no amount of royal displeasure could create one. So, this is the full picture. A queen who bathed 4 times a year, whose teeth had turned black from a lifetime of sugar, whose face was dissolving under a daily application of lead, whose wigs had never been washed, and who lived in a palace that smelled, by all accounts, worse than many streets. And yet, she remains one of the most studied, most written about, most portrayed figures in the history of Western civilization. She governed for 45 years. She saw off the Spanish Armada. She presided over a cultural flowering that produced Shakespeare, Marlowe, and the foundation's music of the English language, as we still use it today. Greatness and hygiene, it turns out, have very little to do with each other. The next time someone tells you that a powerful figure was larger than life, remember that, in Elizabeth's case, larger than life included the smell and the lead and the wigs and everything that was happening in the palace corridors after dark. She was extraordinary. She was historic, and she was without any question, absolutely revolting. The truth is, the more you look into the daily life of Queen Elizabeth I, the more you realize that her world was built on contradictions. She was powerful, intelligent, and respected across Europe, yet the conditions she lived in were far from what we would consider acceptable today. And what makes this even more fascinating is that none of this was hidden. People at the time knew. They saw it. They wrote about it, but they accepted it as normal. To understand why, we need to step deeper into the mindset of the 16th century. Back then, the idea of cleanliness was very different. People did not believe that water cleaned the body in the way we do today. In fact, many believed that water could actually be dangerous. Doctors warned that bathing too often could open the pores of the skin and allow disease to enter the body. So instead of washing with water, people focused on keeping their clothes clean. This is why Elizabeth changed her linen so often. It was considered a form of hygiene. Fresh linen against the skin was believed to pull away dirt and sweat, but in reality, it only masked the problem. The body was still unwashed, and over time the smell would build. Perfume became the solution. Elizabeth loved strong scents. Her court was filled with the smell of roses, lavender, and musk. Gloves were scented. Handkerchiefs were soaked in perfume. Even furniture and rooms were treated with fragrant oils. But this was not about luxury alone. It was about survival in an environment where natural odors were overwhelming. And yet, perfume could only do so much. Imagine standing in a crowded room, surrounded by dozens of people, all layered in heavy clothing, none of them regularly bathing, all of them trying to cover the smell with perfume. The result was not freshness. It was a strange mixture of sweetness and decay, something that visitors often found shocking. Foreign ambassadors frequently commented on this. They came from different parts of Europe, some with slightly better hygiene practices, and they noticed the difference immediately. But even they did not fully escape the conditions of the time, because this was not just an English problem. It was a European reality. Still, Elizabeth's court stood out because of its size and intensity. Her palace was not just a home. It was a political center. Hundreds of people lived there, worked there, ate there, and competed for her attention every single day. Life at court was not peaceful. It was crowded, loud, and full of tension. And in that environment, personal hygiene was not a priority. What mattered was appearance. Elizabeth understood this better than anyone. She knew that her image was her power. Every detail of how she looked was carefully controlled. The white face, the red hair, the elaborate dresses, these were not just fashion choices. They were symbols. Her pale skin, created with lead makeup, showed that she was above ordinary life. It told people that she did not work in the sun, that she belonged to a higher world. Her wigs, large and dramatic, made her appear larger than life. Her clothing, rich with fabric and jewels, displayed wealth and authority, even if the reality underneath was far less perfect. And this is where the illusion becomes most interesting, because Elizabeth was not trying to be natural. She was trying to be unforgettable. In a time when portraits were one of the only ways to preserve an image, she carefully shaped how she would be remembered. Painters were instructed to show her in a certain way. Her face was often smoothed, idealized, made almost ageless. The scars from smallpox were hidden. The effects of aging were softened. The result is the image we still recognize today. But that image is not the full truth. Behind the portraits was a human body dealing with very real problems. The lead makeup damaged her skin. The lack of dental care destroyed her teeth. The limited bathing allowed dirt and oil to build over time. The wigs, rarely cleaned, added another layer of discomfort. And yet, she continued, because stopping was not an option. If Elizabeth had suddenly appeared in public without makeup, without wigs, Without the carefully constructed image, it would have shocked her court. It could have weakened her authority. In a world where power was often tied to appearance, looking weak or sick was dangerous. So she maintained the illusion, no matter the cost, and she was not alone. Women across Europe followed similar practices. They used lead-based cosmetics. They wore heavy clothing. They avoided bathing too frequently. Elizabeth was simply the most visible example of a much larger pattern, but her position made everything more extreme. As queen, she had access to the best of everything the time could offer, and yet, the best was still deeply flawed. Medicine was limited. Science was incomplete. Many harmful practices were accepted simply because people did not know better. Take dentistry, for example. When Elizabeth's teeth began to decay, there were very few options. Tooth extraction was the most common solution, but it was painful and risky. There was no anesthesia as we know it today, no antibiotics to prevent infection. Every procedure carried danger. So many people avoided dental treatment entirely. This is likely why Elizabeth allowed her teeth to deteriorate over time. The fear of treatment may have been greater than the pain itself, and as her teeth worsened, it affected her speech, her eating, and even her appearance. But again, she adapted. Cloth was used to fill gaps in her mouth. Soft foods became more common in her diet. Public appearances were carefully managed to minimize attention to the issue. Everything was controlled, even the environment around her. Despite the poor sanitation, efforts were made to improve conditions. Floors were covered with rushes plants that could absorb dirt and waste. These were changed occasionally, but not always as often as needed. Over time, layers could build up, trapping smells and bacteria underneath. Windows were opened when possible to allow fresh air inside. Fires were lit, not just for warmth, but to help mask odors. Servants worked constantly to clean and maintain the palace, but the scale of the problem was enormous. With so many people in one place, complete cleanliness was impossible. And yet, life continued. Court events, banquets, ceremonies, political meetings all took place in this environment. People dressed in their finest clothes, covered themselves in perfume, and carried on as if everything was perfectly normal, because to them, it was. This is perhaps the most important point to understand. We look back at these practices and feel shocked, even disgusted. But for the people living at the time, this was simply life. They did not have our knowledge, our technology, or our standards. They worked with what they had, and within those limits, Elizabeth I achieved something extraordinary. She ruled for decades in a time of constant threat. She managed political enemies, religious conflict, and international pressure. She inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure. She became a symbol of strength and stability. None of that changed because of her hygiene. If anything, it makes her story more human, because it reminds us that greatness does not come from perfection. It comes from action, from decisions, from the ability to lead even in imperfect conditions. Elizabeth's world was not clean. It was not comfortable. It was not easy. But it was real. And understanding that reality gives us a deeper appreciation of history. It moves us beyond the polished images and romantic stories and shows us the truth of how people actually lived. A truth that is messy, complicated, and sometimes hard to accept. But also fascinating, because when we look closely, we begin to see that the past was not so different from the present. People still cared about appearance. They still struggled with health. They still balanced image and reality in their daily lives.